In the spring of 1945, with his thousand-year Reich collapsing around him in a 20-meter bunker, Adolf Hitler dictated his final political testament. 60 million people lay dead across the globe. The cities of Europe were graveyards. And in his last will, he didn't mourn, he boasted. He called the annihilation of the Jews his greatest gift to the world. But that's the end. The real question, the one that has haunted historians, survivors, and generations since, is this. How does a failed artist, a man so broke he's sleeping in a Vienna homeless shelter by 1909, become the architect of Auschwitz by 1942? Was it madness, or was it method? Tonight, we're not just counting the 6 million. We are dissecting the metamorphoses of a man into a monster. From the flophouses of Vienna to the death factories of Poland, we uncover how a conspiracy theory became government policy and how an entire nation was convinced that mass murder was a moral imperative. This is the unflinching truth about why Hitler murdered the Jews. The making of a grudge. Vienna and the birth of hatred. Vienna, 1908. The cultural capital of Europe. Grand boulevards, imperial palaces, concert halls, echoing with music. And somewhere in its shadows, a 19-year-old boy steps off a train. Thin mustache, paint-stained fingers, a portfolio of sketches tucked under his arm. His name is Adolf Hitler, and he didn't come to the capital to start a war. He came to be a star. He genuinely believed he had talent. He had spent his teenage years sketching buildings, copying postcards, dreaming of galleries. When his father died, he took it as liberation. Now, nobody could stop him. The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts had other opinions. They rejected him. Not once, twice. His figure drawing lacked promise, they said. For a young man who had already defined his identity around this dream, the rejection was devastating. Within a year, his mother Clara died of breast cancer, treated by a Jewish doctor, Edward Bloch, whom Hitler would later protect. He was 19, Brooke, alone. By late 1909, Hitler was eating at soup kitchens, sleeping in a men's shelter, shoveling snow for coins. His business partner recalled a gaunt, hollow-eyed young man in a stained coat, feet raw from walking, trembling in the cold. But here's what the simplified story often omits. During these years, Hitler had Jewish friends. He sold his paintings almost exclusively to Jewish art dealers like Samuel Morgenstern. His companion Josef Neumann was Jewish. He once praised Jewish philanthropy and called anti-Semitic blood libel myths complete nonsense. What changed? Vienna itself. This wasn't just a city of art and music. It was a pressure cooker of ethnic tension, nationalist fury, and political hatred. And the man who ran it knew exactly how to harness that heat. Karl Lueger was mayor of Vienna. Charismatic, brilliant, openly anti-Semitic. A populist genius who understood that if you give a Strutov a sole world leader of choice, they will give you their souls to our main, and they will set our souls together. I decide who is a Jew, he famously declared, using anti-Semitism as a flexible tool to explain away social ills. His rallies were electric. His crowds were massive. And a young, impressionable Adolf Hitler watched from the back rows, taking mental notes. From Lueger, Hitler learned that hate was politically profitable. The ratings were very stupid, erratic.
From George von Schonerer, he adopted a more violent, pan-German nationalism that viewed history as a biological war between races. Hitler began spending his days in public libraries, not to study art, but to consume the ideological poison of the era. He watched the prosperous Jewish middle class of Vienna, the doctors, the bankers, the journalists, and convinced himself they had stolen his rightful place. He reinterpreted his own hunger and homelessness not as personal failure, but as a conspiracy. He wasn't learning to hate yet. He was learning something more dangerous, that hatred works. By the time he left for Munich in 1913, Hitler wasn't just a failed artist. He had externalized his shame. He had found his scapegoat. But the personal grudge of a homeless drifter was about to be weaponized by the greatest catastrophe in modern history. In the next chapter, the starving artist swaps his paintbrush for a rifle. The Great War provides the stage, and the world will watch as the monster begins to take shape.
The war that broke Germany and gave Hitler his cause. August 19th, 14th. Europe mobilizes for war. And Adolf Hitler, broke, directionless, nursing a decade of failure, volunteers immediately. Not for Austria, the empire he despised. He volunteered for Bavaria, for Germany, the country he had loved from a distance his entire life. They accepted him, paperwork ignored in the chaos of mass mobilization. The failed artist became a soldier. He was a good one. Assigned as a regimental messenger for the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, the List Regiment, Hitler's job was brutal, carrying orders between command posts and frontline units, running through open ground while artillery tore the earth apart around him. It was dangerous, and he performed with absolute discipline. Wounded at the Somme in 1916, temporarily blinded by mustard gas in 1918. He received the Iron Cross, second class, and then, extraordinarily, for an enlisted man, the Iron Cross, first class. Recommended for that medal by Hugo Gutmann, a Jewish officer, a fact Hitler would later bury and distort. For the first time in his adult life, Hitler had found belonging, structure, brotherhood. The chaos of Vienna was gone, replaced by the rigid hierarchy of military life. Then came November 19, 1918. Hitler was lying in a military hospital in Passwalk, temporarily blinded from a gas attack, when a pastor walked into the ward and delivered the news. Germany had surrendered. The Kaiser had abdicated. The war was over. What happened next, Hitler would later describe with theatrical precision. He wrote that darkness fell before his eyes again, that he stumbled back to his bed and wept for the first time since his mother's funeral. But underneath the grief, something harder was forming. How? How had Germany lost? At the front, men were still fighting, still holding. Nothing in the trenches had felt like defeat. So it couldn't have come from the battlefield. It had to have come from within. That is exactly what powerful men wanted soldiers like Hitler to believe. General Ludendorff and Field Marshal Hindenburg, whose catastrophic strategic failures had exhausted Germany's reserves and made defeat inevitable, needed someone else to blame. They pointed at socialist politicians, at the New Republic, at the men who signed the armistice. They called it treason, a knife driven into Germany's back by its own people. The stab-in-the-back myth was born. It had no evidence. Historians unanimously reject it. Germany was militarily finished, outmanned, outgunned, starving, broken after the United States entered the war. There was no conspiracy. There was only collapse. But truth doesn't matter when an entire nation is humiliated and desperate. The myth spread, and far-right groups added one more ingredient, one more face to attach to the betrayal: the Jews. For a man primed by Vienna's atmosphere of blame, psychologically shattered by defeat, searching for an explanation that could absorb his rage, this narrative was intoxicating. Hitler left that hospital no longer just a bitter, failed artist. He left as a man who believed he had finally found his enemy, and he would spend the rest of his life making the world pay for it. The first blueprint, the Gemlich letter and the Nazi Party, Munich, 1919. Germany is unrecognizable. The empire is gone. The streets fill with demobilized soldiers who don't know what to do with their hands now that they're no longer holding rifles. Inflation is quietly destroying the currency. Communist uprisings flare and are crushed in blood. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile new democracy, tries to hold together a nation that fundamentally doesn't want to be held. And Adolf Hitler, 30 years old, is still technically in the army, scraping by on military rations, sleeping in barracks. No career, no prospects, no plan. Then someone noticed him. Captain Karl Mayer ran the Munich Military Intelligence Unit. He was running political education courses, propaganda sessions designed to counter communist influence among returning soldiers. He needed men who could speak, who could persuade, who could inflame. Hitler attended as a student. Then he opened his mouth. The room changed. Officers exchanged glances. This nobody corporal from Vienna could speak in a way that made people lean forward. His sentences had structure. His rage had logic.
His delivery was mesmerizing, impossible to explain, impossible to ignore. Mayer immediately put him to work as a lecturer. Then, in September 1919, came the document that would change everything.
A soldier named Adolf Gemlich sent a written inquiry to Mayer's unit asking for clarification on the Jewish question. Mayer assigned Hitler to respond. What Hitler wrote back is now considered by historians to be the most important document in understanding the ideological origins of the Holocaust, the Gemlich letter. In it, Hitler was cold, precise. He argued that anti-Semitism should not be driven by emotion or mob violence that was messy, inefficient. Instead, he proposed what he called rational anti-Semitism, systematic, legal, state-organized exclusion of Jews from German life. He defined Judaism not as a religion, but as a race. He accused Jews of hoarding wealth and pursuing global domination. Then he stated his ultimate goal with terrifying clarity. The final objective must be the unwavering removal of Jews altogether. Marvin Heer of the Simon Wiesenthal Center later called this the first political document in which Hitler explicitly outlined his plans. The seed of genocide, written in administrative language. Calm, bureaucratic, logical. That was what made it so dangerous. A month later, Mayr sent Hitler to observe a small political gathering at the Sternecker Brewery, a tiny nationalist group called the German Workers' Party, barely 50 members. Folding chairs, beer mugs, passionate speeches, going nowhere. Hitler intended to observe and report back. Instead, he started arguing with a speaker mid-meeting and electrified the room. Party founder Anton Drexler turned to the man next to him and whispered, "That man has a gift." Hitler invited Hitler to join. Hitler hesitated, then accepted. Member number 555 on the party rolls, though Hitler later claimed to be member number 7. His first deliberate act of myth-building. Within 18 months, he had effectively taken over. He renamed the party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, the Nazis. On February 24, 1920, Hitler stood before 2,000 people in Munich's Hofbräuhaus beer hall and unveiled the 25-point program. It demanded the annulment of the Treaty of Versailles, the union of all Germans into one great nation, the nationalization of industries, worker protections, and explicitly, citizenship restricted to those of German blood only, Jews excluded. Permanently. The crowd erupted. But here's what nobody expected. It wasn't just the hatred that resonated, it was the structure. After years of chaos and shame, Hitler was offering something Germany was starving for: an explanation, an enemy, and a promise. The failed painter from Vienna had found his canvas, and he was just getting started. Mein Kampf, When Hatred Became Scripture. November 8, 1923. Munich. Adolf Hitler walks into a crowded beer hall, draws a pistol, and fires into the ceiling. The room goes silent. Then he announces to a stunned crowd of government officials, businessmen, and ordinary Germans that the national revolution has begun. The beer hall push was Hitler's attempt to copy Mussolini's March on Rome, seize power by audacity alone. It failed spectacularly. The following morning, when Hitler's column of stormtroopers marched toward the city center, Bavarian police waited at the Feldherrenhalle monument. Shots were fired. 16 Nazis died. Hitler hit the ground. Whether he threw himself down or was pulled is still debated, and dislocated his shoulder. Within hours, he was arrested, charged with high treason, facing years behind bars. Then, history turned on a devastating hinge. The Bavarian court that tried Hitler in February 1924 allowed him to turn the proceedings into a stage. Judge Georg Neidhardt, sympathetic to nationalist politics, gave Hitler extraordinary latitude to speak. And Hitler spoke, performing not for the jury but for the reporters filling the press gallery. Every speech transmitted to newspapers across Germany. A man on trial for attempting to overthrow the government, delivering passionate, articulate arguments about national betrayal, Jewish conspiracy, and German destiny. He was sentenced to 5 years, the minimum possible for high treason. He served 9 months. Those 9 months, spent in the comfortable Landsberg prison, private room, visitor privileges, food packages from admirers, produced something that would kill millions. Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Hitler dictated it to Rudolf Hess, his devoted deputy, who had voluntarily imprisoned himself alongside his leader. What the book contained was not original. Hitler was a synthesizer, a man who had spent 15 years absorbing the most extreme ideological currents of his time and was now pouring them into a single document. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion sat at its center. That document, a proven forgery, fabricated by the Russian secret police in the early 1900s to justify Tsarist persecution of Jews, claimed to be minutes of a secret Jewish conspiracy for global domination. It was debunked almost immediately. The Times of London proved it was plagiarized from an 1864 French political satire. None of that mattered. By the time Hitler was writing Mein Kampf, the protocols had been translated into dozens of languages. Henry Ford had published his own anti-Semitic series, The International Jew, which drew heavily from the protocols and sold millions of copies. Hitler kept a portrait of Ford in his office. In Mein Kampf, Hitler cited the protocols as proof of Jewish conspiracy. When critics pointed out they were forgeries, he dismissed the objection with circular logic. The fact that Jews protested so loudly, he argued, was itself proof of authenticity. This was the pseudo-intellectual architecture of Mein Kampf. Traditional religious anti-Semitism, centuries of Christian Europe blaming Jews for the death of Christ, fused with modern racial pseudoscience that dressed bigotry in the language of biology. Jews were not merely religiously different, they were biologically inferior, racially parasitic, inevitably the enemy. Chapter 11, People and Race, introduced Hitler's hierarchy of humanity. The Aryan race was the culture creator. Jews were the culture destroyer. Their entire existence was biological warfare against superior races. Violence wasn't cruelty within this framework, it was self-defense at the species level. The book also laid out foreign policy with clarity that should have terrified Europe. Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, in the East. The Slavic peoples were racially inferior, and their lands were Germany's by natural right. An alliance with Britain, destruction of France, eastward expansion. Written down, published. Available in any German bookshop. When the first volume appeared in July 1925, the liberal press dismissed it. Too crude, too rambling. Sales were modest, 9,000 copies in 1925, 6,000 in 1926. Banks collapsed. Unemployment exploded. The Weimar Republic began visibly disintegrating. And suddenly, a book that had seemed like the renting of a marginal extremist began reading like prophecy to millions of desperate Germans. By 1933, the year Hitler became chancellor, Mein Kampf sold over 1 million copies in a single year. It was given to newlyweds as a wedding gift, distributed to university graduates, placed in school libraries, pressed into soldiers' hands. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, understood something crucial. The specific arguments of Mein Kampf mattered less than its emotional architecture. The book's power wasn't in its ideas, it was in its feeling. The feeling of a people wronged, of a nation betrayed, of a destiny stolen by invisible enemies, now finally identified. Goebbels stripped the biological language and replaced it with simpler, rawer, emotional appeals. The enemy within, the global conspiracy, the German people's right to reclaim what was theirs. By 1932, the Nazi Party had gone from 2.6% of the national vote to 37.4%. Mein Kampf had done exactly what Hitler wrote it to do. Not persuade intellectuals, not win academic debates. Build an emotional consensus that hatred was logic, that annihilation was self-defense, that the man who had written it all down from a prison cell was not a criminal, he was a prophet. In January 1933, Germany handed that prophet the keys to the state. What he did with them was already written. Every step, every law, every camp, it was all already there, in a book, that the world had chosen not to take seriously. That mistake would cost 6 million lives. Hatred becomes law, the Nazi state and the Nuremberg laws. January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler is appointed Reich Chancellor of Germany. And the ideology that had spent 14 years building itself in beer halls and prison cells and propaganda pamphlets walks through the front door of the German state and sits down at the desk. What happened next was not spontaneous. It was not chaotic. It was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly well organized. A systematic legal dismantling of Jewish life in Germany, conducted through proper bureaucratic channels, signed by proper officials, published in proper government gazettes. Hatred had found its paperwork. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire of February 27th provided the pretext Hitler needed. Emergency powers were granted. Civil liberties suspended. Political opposition began disappearing into improvised detention centers, the embryonic concentration camps. Dachau, established in March 1933, while the legal framework of the new state was being constructed around them. April 1st, 1933, the first nationwide anti-Jewish action, a state-organized boycott of Jewish businesses. CA stormtroopers positioned outside Jewish shops, law firms, and medical practices across Germany with signs reading, "Germans, defend yourselves, don't buy from Jews." It was presented as a spontaneous expression of popular outrage. It was centrally coordinated by Goebbels down to the hour. 6 days later, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Jews media fostered by former force. Day 1, ethnic soldiers. ND as worse police officers. World War, night officers who also worked everywhere to the public on their side. Thousands of teachers, judges, doctors, university professors dismissed overnight. Exceptions carved out temporarily for war veterans. A small mercy that would itself be eliminated within 2 years. The laws multiplied through the 1933 and 1934 with bureaucratic speed. Jews banned from journalism, from the arts, from farming, from the stock exchange. Each law individually manageable. Collectively, the systematic erasure of an entire community from German economic and cultural life. Then came September 15th, 1935, Nuremberg, the Nuremberg Wars. 2 pieces of legislation that redefined what it meant to be German and what it meant to be Jewish, with the cold precision of a biological classification system. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of German citizenship entirely. They became subjects, legal non-persons within the country many of their families had inhabited for centuries. The law for the protection of German blood and honor criminalized marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. It prohibited Jewish families from employing German women under 45 as domestic workers. It reached into the most intimate corners of private life and planted the state there. Supporting decrees defined the categories. 3 or 4 Jewish gamdrents, full Jew. 1 or 2, Mischling, mixed blood, first or second degree. German bureaucracy developed genealogical tables, family trees, racial certificates. Churches and town halls became instruments of racial classification. Ordinary citizens hired genealogists to prove their Aryan ancestry. Racism had acquired the appearance of administrative order. Then, November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. A German diplomat assassinated in Paris by a young Jewish man whose family had been brutally deported to Poland. Goebbels used it as a trigger. Across Germany and Austria in a single coordinated night, over 1,000 synagogues burned, 7,000 Jewish businesses destroyed, 90 Jews killed directly, 30,000 arrested and sent to concentration camps. The police were ordered not to intervene unless Aryan property was threatened. The morning after, the Nazi government fined the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage done to them. Kristallnacht was the moment the mask fully came off. Legal discrimination had become physical terror. The line between exclusion and elimination was no longer a line at all. And the world watched, issued statements, expressed concern, and did nothing that mattered. The final step was already being prepared. The final solution, from persecution to extermination. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland, and the persecution of Jews, which had spent 6 years operating through laws, boycotts, and bureaucratic exclusion, shifts into something categorically different, something that required not just paperwork, but geography, not just discrimination, but territory. Millions of Jews now under German control in a single military campaign. The question that consumed Nazi leadership was no longer how to marginalize Jews within Germany, it was what to do with all of them. The first answer was concentration. Ghettos established in major Polish cities, Warsaw in October 1940, Lodz in February 1940, Krakow shortly after. Walled-off districts where hundreds of thousands of people were forced into spaces designed for tens of thousands. The Warsaw Ghetto held over 400,000 people at its peak. Starvation rations, no medicine, epidemics moving through overcrowded buildings with mathematical inevitability. The mortality rate was catastrophic by deliberate design. Then, June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and here the machinery of murder shifted into a completely different gear. 4 mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, followed the Wehrmacht eastward with explicit orders to execute Jews, Soviet commissars, and other designated enemies behind the advancing front lines. These were not soldiers caught up in combat violence. They were organized execution squads moving systematically through Soviet territories. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kyiv, Einsatzgruppe C shot 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children over 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941, the largest single massacre of the Holocaust. Completed in 48 hours, documented in German administrative reports filed afterward with the same tone used for supply requisitions. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had killed an estimated 500,000 people. But even this industrial pace of murder was considered insufficient by Nazi leadership. January 20th, 1942, a villa in Wannsee, a wealthy suburb of Berlin, 15 senior Nazi officials gathered for a 90-minute meeting chaired by Reinhard Heydrich. The purpose? Coordinate the logistics of what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, the complete physical annihilation of every Jew in Europe, estimated at 11 million people. The Wannsee Conference didn't decide to commit genocide. That decision had already been made. It coordinated the bureaucracy around a genocide already in progress. 6 dedicated extermination camps were constructed in occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Delzak, Chelmno, Majdanek, equipped with gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, crematoria running continuously, railway lines built directly to platform ramps where arriving prisoners were separated, those deemed fit for forced labor to the right, everyone else directly to the gas chambers. At Auschwitz-Birkenau alone, an estimated 1.1 million people were murdered. The entire operation, from deportation orders to cremation, was administered by ordinary German bureaucrats. Train schedules coordinated by railway officials. Zyklon B supplied by a chemical company. Death recorded in ledgers by camp administrators. Historian Raoul Hilbert spent 30 years documenting what he called the destruction process in his landmark work, The Destruction of the European Jews. His central conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. The Holocaust required the willing participation of virtually every sector of German society. Not monsters, not madmen, bureaucrats, engineers, lawyers, train conductors. By 1945, 6 million Jews were dead. The machinery had worked exactly as designed. After the ashes, survivors, justice, and the question that never goes away. April 19th, 45, Allied forces enter the camps. What they find stops hardened combat soldiers in their tracks. Men who had fought across North Africa and Western Europe, who had seen friends die beside them, who thought they understood what war looked like. Standing at the gates of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, unable to move, unable to speak. The liberation was not a triumphant moment. It was a reckoning. Approximately 250,000 Jewish survivors emerged from the camps, skeletal, stateless, with nowhere to return to. Their communities erased, their families gone, their homes occupied by strangers. Hundreds of thousands spent years in displaced persons camps across Europe, trapped in a bureaucratic limbo while Western governments debated immigration quotas and political complications. Then came Nuremberg. Between 1945 and 1946, 24 senior Nazi leaders were tried before the International Military Tribunal. 12 were sentenced to death. Hermann Göring cheated the gallows by swallowing a cyanide capsule hours before his scheduled execution. Rudolf Hess received life imprisonment and served every day of it until his death in Spandau prison in 1987. The trials established something permanently important, that crimes against humanity existed as a legal category, that following orders was not an adequate defense, that individuals bore personal responsibility for state-sanctioned genocide, but justice, even imperfect justice, reached only a fraction of the perpetrators. Thousands of SS officers, camp administrators, and Einsatzgruppen members lived out quiet post-war lives in West Germany, Argentina, and the United States. The Cold War made prosecuting former Nazis politically inconvenient when their anti-communist expertise was suddenly useful. In 1948, the State of Israel was founded. For survivors scattered across a hostile world, It represented something beyond politics, proof that annihilation had not succeeded, that Jewish life continued. Survivor testimonies: Elie Wiesel's Night, Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, became essential documents of human experience. Not just historical records, but moral texts that generations continue reading because they answer the hardest question humanity asks itself. How do ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil? Historians still debate the precise roots of Hitler's hatred. Psychologists still examine his paranoia, his failures, his pathological need for an enemy. The debate continues because the answer matters beyond biography. Because Hitler didn't build the Holocaust alone. He built it with the compliance of millions, with the silence of millions more, with the indifference of a world that received the warnings and turned away. The question Auschwitz leaves behind isn't only, how did this happen? It's, what are you doing to make sure it never happens again? That question has no expiration date, and it belongs to all of us.